What happens when silence holds more fire than words? The question drifts like smoke through the Kentucky hills, lingering unanswered, as though the land itself has known the truth far longer than the men who walk upon it. In the stillness of winter, silence is everywhere, thick as frost on the ground, heavy as the clouds that hang low and gray. The frozen fields stretch wide, stripped bare of tobacco and corn, a hushed expanse where the earth seems to hold its breath. The wind moves gently through the naked trees, their branches groaning like the timbers of an old church about to collapse. Every sound is amplified against the quiet, the creak of wagon wheels, the bark of a distant dog, the metallic clink of a chain. But above all of it lies silence, deep, unbroken, like a vast lake of ice. To the masters it feels like obedience. To those who live beneath the lash it is something else entirely. Silence as shield, silence as defiance, silence as waiting. Fire hides in silence the way a spark hides in dry kindling. It needs no warning, no roar, no threat. It waits, patient, biding its time in the cold. And when it comes, it consumes without mercy, turning wood to ash, turning voices to echoes. The hills of Kentucky know this truth. They have seen barns burn in summer storms, cabins devoured in a single night, smoke rising into the air like prayers no one dares to speak aloud. Some say vengeance announces itself with shouts and blades. But in this place, in this time, vengeance waits in silence, like breath held too long, like frost pressing down on the earth until it cracks. The silence of the fields is not empty. It is filled with something gathering unseen. In the frozen hush of 1837, before the thaw of spring, before the fields awaken, silence holds more than submission. It carries a promise, one that will smolder unseen, until the night comes when silence itself becomes fire. The Whitford estate spread across the Kentucky hills like a scar on the land. Its tobacco fields rolled wide and brown, stalks long stripped bare by winter's hand, their brittle stems jutting from the frozen soil like bones left unburied. The house itself loomed on the rise, whitewashed and proud, its columns gleaming even in the weak sun. But the true heart of the estate was not the grand house. It was the fields and the quarters, where silence was beaten into men and women until it became second nature. Here, days began in darkness. Before the first light touched the frost, chains clinked and bodies moved like shadows across the yard. The air filled with the dull thud of boots and the crack of whips, sharp enough to split the silence wide open before it sealed again. Songs rose sometimes, faint and trembling, but they were quickly hushed, as though the air itself would betray their courage to listening ears. Overseer Richard Hale ruled this rhythm with cruelty sharpened like a blade. Broad-shouldered, his face perpetually twisted in a sneer, he carried the whip as though it were an extension of his arm. His voice was coarse, his commands clipped and cruel, and when he laughed, it was only at another's pain. Among the enslaved, his name was whispered like a curse, as though speaking it too loud might draw him out of the shadows. Hale's cabin stood just beyond the slave quarters, a squat structure of timber and smoke-stained brick. Though smaller than the master's mansion, it loomed more ominously over those forced to pass it. It was not just a home, it was a symbol, authority made into wood and stone. From its doorway, Hale watched the fields, his presence heavy, suffocating, as if the cabin itself breathed menace. Life on the Whitford estate was an unbroken cycle, dawn to dusk labor, cold mornings that stiffened the hands, nights that carried exhaustion deeper than sleep. The silence here was not peace. It was weight, an unspoken law pressed onto every tongue. In such silence, words became dangerous, but thoughts could not be chained. And in those thoughts, something darker, something patient began to stir. Among the enslaved of the Whitford estate, one man carried silence like a cloak. His name was Moses. Broad in the shoulders, weathered in the hands, he bore the look of a man broken into obedience, but only to those who did not look too closely. To the masters and their overseers, Moses was the picture of compliance. He bent his head when ordered, spoke only when spoken to, and never once raised his voice in defiance. They saw in him a servant too weary to resist, a man empty to fight. But the truth lived elsewhere, hidden deep behind his eyes. For those who worked beside him in the biting cold, who shared the same scraps of food and the same whispered prayers at night, there was something unmistakable in his gaze. When Moses looked at a man, it was not the look of submission. It was a steady weight, a kind of watchfulness that unsettled even those who did not understand it. Some said he saw further than most. Some said he was waiting for something the rest of them could not yet name. His trade gave him the perfect disguise. Moses was skilled with wood, trusted to mend fences, carve handles, patch broken shutters, and repair the cabins scattered across the estate. He worked with quiet precision, hammer and chisel steady in his hands. The overseer saw only a laborer shaping planks. But others saw how he lingered on beams and door frames, how he studied nails and hinges as if memorizing their secrets. His silence was not emptiness. It was gathering, calculating, shaping something no one else could see. Among the quarters, whispers clung to him. Children kept close to his side, drawn to the calm in his stillness. Elders gave him the kind of nod reserved for men who carried storms within. Even those too afraid to hope felt a shiver when he passed, as though his silence spoke louder than any words they dared utter. Moses did not shout nor threaten nor curse. He did not need to. His silence unsettled more than noise ever could. In that silence lived fire, waiting, patient, certain. Cruelty was nothing new on the Whitford estate, but in the winter of 1837, Overseer Hale sharpened it into something almost ritualistic. He seemed to take pleasure in reminding the enslaved that their lives were his to break. Whippings grew harsher, delivered for the smallest hesitation. Meals shrank until bellies knotted with hunger. At night, men were made to stand in the yard while Hale jeered, calling them animals unworthy of rest. His laughter carried into the quarters long after the lash had quieted. Yet alongside his cruelty came something else, small disturbances, too subtle for the masters to notice but whispered about in the shadows. Nails began disappearing from the tool shed, one or two at a time. A hammer left on the bench would be gone the next morning. Bundles of wood scraps vanished, though no one had dared burn extra firewood during the bitter cold. When Hale counted the tools, his scowl deepened, and his rage fell on the nearest back. The enslaved began to speak of omens. They said crows gathered on the fence rails at dusk, black wings beating against the gray sky like restless spirits. Some swore their sleep was filled with strange dreams, visions of fire licking the tobacco fields, of cabins turning to ash. Even the dogs seemed unsettled. They barked at night for no reason, hackles raised toward the dark, as if they sensed a presence beyond human eyes. Through it all, Moses moved as he always had, quiet, obedient, unremarkable. He mended gates, patched roofs, carried wood to the cabins. Hale looked at him and saw only a silent drudge too beaten to matter. But in Moses's steady hands, the missing nails found purpose. The scraps of wood became more than refuse. Each small piece was part of a larger design, one only he could see. While others whispered of curses and signs, Moses did not speak at all. He did not need to. In silence he prepared, unnoticed by masters and overseer alike. The frost bit harder, the field stayed bare, and the sky above the estate hung heavy with smoke-gray clouds. Something was gathering beneath that silence, something that waited for its moment to strike. And when it came, it would strike without warning, sudden, final, and merciless. The winter deepened, and with it came a fever that spread like smoke through the slave quarters. It began with coughs, low and rattling in the chest, then grew into nights drenched in sweat, bodies trembling against the cold earth floor. Children burned with heat, their eyes glassy. Men and women staggered in the fields, too weak to swing hoes or carry loads. One by one, voices grew faint, and by dawn some never rose again. The overseers blamed the enslaved themselves. Hale barked that it was laziness, that sickness was a mask for weakness. He forced fevered men to their feet, drove them to the fields, their bodies bent double under the lash. When they collapsed, he spat on them, declaring that the earth had no use for cowards. The masters nodded, satisfied with his cruelty, as if punishment alone could silence death. But in the quarters, the whispers told another story. Some said the spirits of the dead had returned, restless, angry at the suffering of their kin. Others swore the fever was no sickness at all but a curse, a sign that the land itself rejected its masters. Dreams turned strange and heavy, of smoke curling through the rafters, of voices calling from the river. Mothers clutched their children tighter, praying not just to God but to whatever force might still be listening in the night. Hale grew more paranoid with each passing day. He stalked the fields with whip in hand, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. He struck men for pausing, women for glancing away, children for breathing too loud. His fury had no reason anymore. It was a shield against his own unease. For though he never spoke it, even he felt something pressing in the silence. And always Moses was there, silent, watchful, his body bent under labor, his hands steady on wood and nail. He did not cough, did not sway, did not falter. Hale's whip passed over him, though not for mercy, rather because the overseer could not bear the way Moses's silence stared back at him. There was no defiance in his eyes, no tremor in his hands, only a calm that unsettled Hale more than any rebellion ever could. It was as if Moses already knew something Hale did not. And that knowledge, unspoken, invisible, was more dangerous than fire. Long before the winter of 1837, Moses had learned the price of sound. Years earlier, he had once raised his voice in protest when his wife and infant son were torn from him at the auction block. His shout had echoed through the slave pens, raw and desperate, but it did nothing. The trader smirked, the chains clattered, and his family was marched downriver, swallowed by the current of commerce that carried souls like cargo. He never saw them again. On that day his wife turned once, just once, her face streaked with tears. Her lips formed words not loud enough for the traders, not sharp enough for the whip, only for him. "Let silence be your weapon." The words burned into him deeper than any lash. In that moment Moses understood. Sound could be beaten down, mocked, dismissed. Silence, though silence could not be chained, it could endure longer than any scream. From then on he wore silence as others wore scars. There had been another who deepened that lesson. Old Jacob, a man bent with years in the fields, whose eyes carried the dull glow of coals that never quite died. Jacob had once leaned close to Moses by the smokehouse, his voice barely a whisper. Fire cleans more than wood, it cleans names. He spoke of fields burned to ash, of barns that crumbled in flame, of the way fire could erase the master's mark and leave only memory behind. To Moses, those words became scripture. The years that followed carved him hollow. Overseers came and went, cruelty rose and fell, but Moses remained, a quiet shadow, bending but never breaking. His silence grew into armor, his grief hardened into a kind of stone. Outwardly he was obedient, steady, unthreatening. Inwardly he carried a fire banked deep, waiting for the right breath of wind. Now, as Hale's cruelty poisoned the fields, as fever gnawed at the quarters, Moses's purpose sharpened. His revenge was no longer for himself alone. It was for the wife whose voice had been stolen, the child who had no chance to speak, the elders who died nameless, the children born in chains. Moses's silence was not absence, it was promise, and that promise would not remain hidden much longer. The cold had not yet broken when a preacher arrived at the Whitford estate, summoned by Colonel Whitford to still the unrest. He was a thin man in a black coat, his voice shrill as he recited scripture in the yard. He preached obedience as salvation, suffering as God's will. He spoke of silence as submission, of patience as the path to heaven. The enslaved stood in rows, their breath clouding the air, their eyes fixed on the frozen ground. None dared interrupt him, yet the weight of their silence pressed heavier with each verse. For a moment the preacher believed he had done his work, but among the enslaved, hearts did not soften, they hardened. Every word urging compliance only deepened their quiet resentment. For men and women who had buried children, who had felt chains bite their wrists, there was no promise in heaven sweet enough to sanctify Hale's whip. Their silence in that moment was not agreement, it was rejection. Colonel Whitford felt it, though he could not name it. He frowned as he looked over the bowed heads, sensing that something had shifted in the air. Hale felt it too. His eyes darted from face to face, lingering on Moses. The overseer's hand tightened around his whip, though Moses did nothing more than stand, shoulders bowed, eyes lowered. Yet even that stillness unnerved him. Later that week, Hale called Moses to his cabin. "Wood," he barked, tossing a hand toward the pile near the smokehouse. Moses obeyed without a word, carrying the logs through the cold night. The overseer's cabin loomed before him, timber walls blackened by years of smoke, a single lantern glowing in the window. Hale vanished inside, grumbling, the door left ajar. Moses laid the logs neatly by the wall. His eyes lingered on the door. He studied the hinges, the thick frame, the grain of the wood. He traced the way the latch slid into place, the way the boards fitted tight against one another. To Hale, it was just a door. To Moses, it was a weakness waiting to be turned into a weapon. That night, as the wind carried the sound of coughing from the quarters, Moses walked back through the frost, silent as always. But in his mind the plan was no longer fog. It was clear, sharp, inevitable. The cabin would burn, and silence would light the fire. The night came without a moon, the sky heavy with clouds, the fields washed in darkness. It was the kind of silence that seemed to swallow every sound, the perfect cloak for what Moses carried in his heart. He moved like a shadow between the quarters and Hale's cabin, his steps measured, his hands steady. In one arm he carried the wood, in the other a small bundle of nails, each one cold and sharp as the air itself. Inside the cabin, Hale had drunk himself into a stupor. His voice had echoed earlier in the night, slurred curses spilling out the door, the stench of whiskey drifting into the frost. Now his lantern glowed faintly through the window, throwing crooked light across the yard. Moses paused, listening. The overseer's boots scuffed against the floorboards, then silence. Hale had fallen into the restless sleep of a man too sure of his own power. Moses worked swiftly. Each nail drove into the cabin door with a muffled thud, his hammer cushioned by rags he'd wrapped tight. He set them deep, methodical, each strike deliberate, sealing the overseer inside. The wood shuddered, the hinges groaned, but held fast. When the last nail bit into the frame, Moses stood for a long moment, his breath white against the dark. Inside, Hale stirred. His voice rose, confused at first, then sharp with anger. The latch rattled, the door strained. His curses rang against the timbers, followed by the heavy pound of his fists. "Open this door, boy," he roared, his words cracked with rage. But the door held, unyielding, as Moses stepped back into the yard. He gathered the scraps of wood, set them in a neat pile against the wall. From his pocket came a sliver of cloth, soaked in oil, twisted into a torch. One spark, one breath, and flame licked upward, eager and bright against the night air. The fire spread quickly, climbing the boards, swallowing the tarred seams. Smoke curled toward the sky, first thin, then thick, blotting out the stars. Hale's screams rose, piercing, then broke into hoarse cries. He pounded and cursed, a man stripped of power, trapped in the very walls that once marked his authority. Crackling wood answered him, louder with each breath, drowning his voice in flame. Moses stood motionless. He did not speak, did not flinch. His silence was complete, unbroken even as the cabin roared with fire. He watched as smoke curled into the night sky, steady and still, until Hale's voice faded and only the burning remained. By dawn, the Whitford estate was no longer the same. The overseer's cabin stood as a blackened husk, smoke still rising in lazy curls from its charred beams. The smell of scorched timber and burned flesh clung to the air, bitter and unshakable. Fear rippled across the fields like a sickness the masters could not cure. Colonel Whitford, his face pale as the frost, stormed across the yard, shouting orders no one obeyed. He called for buckets of water, for men to clear the ruin, for women to return to the fields. But his words fell hollow. The enslaved moved in silence, their eyes fixed on the smoldering cabin. Some stood rigid, trembling not with fear but with something colder, heavier, as though they had witnessed more than fire. Whitford's authority crumbled with each passing hour. The terror that Hale had wielded was gone, and in its place lay confusion, dread, and a silence the colonel could not command. By evening he packed a trunk, hitched a horse, and rode away. His mansion, so proud on its rise, stood empty, its windows dark, as though even the house itself wished to flee the ruin that stained the land. In the shadows of night, some enslaved took their chance. They slipped past the gates, vanishing into the woods and the rivers beyond, chasing a freedom they had only ever whispered about. Others remained, bound by fear or by roots too deep to tear free. For them, every glance at the ruins was a reminder of the screams they had heard, of the silence that followed. No trace of Moses was ever found. Some swore they had seen him slip into the trees as the flames devoured the cabin. Others insisted he walked straight into the smoke itself, swallowed whole by the fire he had lit. In the days that followed, his name was spoken rarely, and only in hushed tones. The cabin was never rebuilt. Its blackened ruin stood as a scar upon the estate, a place no one dared to touch. Silence lingered there, thick and heavy, broken only by the wind hissing through charred timbers. And in that silence it seemed Moses still remained, an absence more haunting than presence, a shadow that neither chains nor fire could erase. Years bled into decades, and the Whitford estate faded into ruin. The mansion crumbled, its shutters hanging loose, its grand columns streaked with moss. The tobacco fields grew wild with weeds, swallowing the furrows where men once bent their backs from dawn to dusk. But the overseer's cabin remained, or rather, what was left of it. Travelers along the Kentucky backroads whispered of the place they called the burned cabin. They said the ground there never healed, that no grass dared grow over the blackened earth. At night, the ruins seemed to breathe, smoke curling from the soil as though the fire still smoldered beneath. Children of the hills told stories to scare one another. On still nights, they said, you could hear the echo of nails being driven into wood, sharp, steady strikes, though no hammer could be seen. Some claimed they woke to the sound of fists pounding against an unseen door, followed by the muffled cries of a man begging to be let out. Parents dismissed such tales as childish fancy, yet their eyes betrayed unease when they passed the ruins after dark. Locals swore that on cold mornings, a pale ribbon of smoke rose from the charred beams, drifting up into the sky though no fire had touched the wood in half a century. Hunters told of dogs that would not cross the clearing, tails tucked, ears pinned, barking at shadows only they could sense. And then there were those who claimed to have seen him. A tall figure standing among the ruins, shoulders squared, face obscured in shadow. He never spoke, never moved, only watched in silence. Those who encountered the figure said they felt no malice, only a chill, as if silence itself had taken shape in human form. Years later, when a storm unearthed one of the beams from the cabin's foundation, a faint word was found scorched into the wood. Not carved with a knife, not written with ink, but etched as though the fire itself had formed the letters. Silence. No one could say who had placed it there or how it had survived the flames. The story lingers still, carried in whispers from one generation to the next. A warning, a legend, a truth too heavy for words. They thought silence meant submission, but silence, like smoke, can burn a house to ash. Moses' silence became his weapon, his fire a voice for generations who were never allowed to speak. What does his story mean to you, knowing how much our ancestors endured in silence? Share your feelings in the comments. We want to hear your voice. And if you believe stories like this must never be forgotten, please like this video and subscribe so we can keep bringing our history and our power to light.